Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Ballard. I'm the Customer Success Manager at VoltDB. Welcome to our webinar. We're going to be going over how to get started with VoltDB running in Docker. So we're going to get right into it. Let me go over just the agenda. Pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do, and I assume you are somewhat familiar with VoltDB, but if not, you can go to VoltDB.com and click on some of the resources there and get a little bit more familiar. But there's not a whole lot of expectation, so I'll certainly go over some basics with you here today. And the focus here is to get you started using Docker to launch VoltDB. So first item is we're going to just do the simplest case. Just run a standalone, just a single container that's got VoltDB running, so we can interact with it and see that we've got a database now. And so maybe to start with, why would you want to do that? Could be for development reasons. Like as part of your development process, you want to run the database. And you want to run it in an environment that simulates maybe some of the other software you'll be working with, like if you do your development on Mac, but you want to test on Linux, you can have a Linux Docker container, or you could be on Windows even, and that way you'd be able to run it within a Linux environment. Then the next thing is we'll talk a little bit about the storage, because storage is very important for a database. We want our data to be there for us and not just gone as soon as the containers are shut down. So we'll go through that, and there's a couple options there. Then we're going to expand this to show a cluster of VoltDB, a VoltDB database that's running as a cluster. So it's made up of multiple nodes or hosts that are running in separate Docker containers. And then lastly, what we'll do, because the first of these examples we're going through using the Docker image that's pre-built, that's available on Docker Hub. So we'll use that, but that's our open source version of VoltDB. And then what we'll show is, especially for customers or anyone who's evaluating VoltDB, who wants to use some of the more advanced features of Enterprise Edition, you can build your own Docker image. So it's a pretty straightforward process, and we'll go through how to do that. And then the way you use it would be the same as what we've already shown. And lastly, we'll open up for questions. If anyone has questions along the way, feel free. There's a way in the webinar software you can, I think, raise your hand, or you can type in questions, and then we'll be happy to answer them quickly if we can, or we'll address them at the end. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to actually jump right into my command line and text here. So to start with, let me just split my screen. Okay, so we'll make this document available. There's a follow-up email that we send out with after the webinar, and so we'll make sure that this is available. And this is eventually going to be all on our website. So let me just go through, and let's start with the first example. So we're going to start by running a standalone node that's using the VoltDB Community Edition that's pre-built as an image. Let me show you where you can get that to start with. So if we bring up, if you Google Docker VoltDB, you'll find this. This will be the top hit. But it's on Docker Hub, so if you're within Docker, the Docker universe, you can just type VoltDB, and this will also be the top hit there as well. So easy to find. And this has some instructions. This is kind of the basis for the instructions I'm following today. And so you can follow along with this. and this also has links to some of the files that are used. So as we go through, you'll see I have a couple Docker files I'm using. This is the one that goes with this image. There's an entry point script that's used when the container starts. This is the script that runs. There's a deployment file. This is a standard configuration file that's used for VoltDB, where you specify what parameters you want to use, what features you want enabled, and that sort of thing. So those are all available here with links. And again, this is just right on the Docker Hub. You can find it searching for VoltDB. Okay, so let me go back here. So I've set this up. I've got a little folder here that I'm using for our webinar today. I'm going to start in the first subfolder for our standalone example. Okay, and so you don't really need any VoltDB software installed or downloaded to do this, because of the images on the Docker Hub. It's available, through the Docker software. What you do need to have Docker installed itself, and so I'm not going to cover that. But on a Mac, there's a Docker app that runs, which is fantastic. On a Windows or Linux platform, there's similar packages available. So I think on Linux, it's going to be a little bit more of a command line interface, anyhow, really all I have here is just that Docker is running. That's the nice thing. With this, I don't really use the graphical interface much more than that. So we're just going to be on the command line. So we have Docker. So we can see we have Docker installed here. So the first thing we need to do is create a network, and this should be a bridge network. And we want to create our own bridge network, not use Docker has by default, there's a bridge network. So what I can do is if I say Docker network ls, it will show me all of the networks. There's one here called bridge that you always have. You don't want to rely on just this one, because later on when we do multiple nodes, they can't talk to each other. You have to create your own, then they'll talk to each other using the host names and whatnot. So that's what we've already done here, but the command is very simple: Docker network create -d bridge. That's the type of network we're creating, and we give it a name, Volt local cluster. You could call it whatever you want, but we reference it later in the example. So yeah, so if you change the name, you want to make sure you change it in these other places as we go through. Okay, so that's already done. I won't run the command again, but you can easily create the network like that. And now we're ready to go ahead and start VoltDB. Okay, so I'm going to do that here. I'm just going to copy and paste this command. And let me maybe go over what this is going to do. It's going to run a Docker container. The container is coming from this VoltDB/VoltDB-community. We're using the latest version. Our network is Volt local cluster. We're giving this container a name. We're calling it Node 1. And we're specifying some parameters. These are special parameters that are, I guess, unique to the VoltDB Docker image. So we have a parameter host count and hosts. Okay, so we'll get into this a bit more, but for now we're saying we want one host, and the hosts list basically is just this node that we're creating. It's node 1. These are parameters that VoltDB uses. So your Docker is going to start, your container is going to start, and it's going to start the VoltDB. There's a script that's going to launch VoltDB, and then VoltDB, once it's up, is going to want to look at this parameter and say, what are the other nodes I'm connecting to, so I can find them and I can probe on the network and we can form a cluster and get going. But this is just a standalone, so there's nothing to find. It's just going to be local. So we can simply paste this here. I'll make this bigger. All right, and we get this big number, this big unique ID, and now we're running. So we can say Docker PS. We can see that we have something running here. The command it's running is this Docker entry point. That's the script that runs, that's part of the image. So we see what we've got there, and that's great. Now, if you're familiar at all with VoltDB, there's a command line interface SQL command, and so on my machine, I can just say SQL command and hit enter. If I don't have any, security enabled or any other special changes to the port numbers or anything like that, that would just take me right into the command line interface. In this case, it's running in a Docker container, and there's a mapping. You see here in this ls output, there's these maps between port numbers on the, on my laptop on the host, and the port numbers inside the container that the VoltDB process is using. So there's a mapping there. Now, it's a little hard to read, so there's another command that we can use, this Docker port, and we can put the name of the container. So we can say Docker port node 1, and it gives it a little cleaner listing. And again, this assumes maybe you know a little bit about VoltDB, but for the SQL interface, we're going to connect on the database user port, which by default is 21212. And so in my instance here, that has been mapped to this 32768. It's a lovely number. So I can now connect saying SQL command, there's an option -- port equals, oops, wrong thing, 32768. Okay, so I'm talking to the database. I can say list tables. There are no tables, so I can create a table. Let's create table foo. Let's give it an ID, integer, not null. How about message, varchar 100. Okay. This is VoltDB, and I always like to point out some, the special great things about VoltDB. So we're going to partition this table. So that's kind of one of our fundamentals. So let's do that. Partition table foo on column ID. Okay. The capitalization doesn't matter. I'm just being special here. Okay, so we have a partitions table now. So our Docker VoltDB instance that's got multiple SQL engines running inside of it will distribute this table across those engines depending on the value of the ID column. That's how the partitioning works. It's sort of like an automatic sharding mechanism. Okay, so we can insert a record. So we can say insert into foo values 1 hello. Okay. So our data's there, and that's great. All right, and we can exit from the SQL command interface, and let's go back and see what's next. So we created a table. And so now let's, how do you stop and restart? So if you notice, when we started this Docker container, we had to give this sort of complicated command with lots of parameters. So Docker run -- blah, 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 blah. Okay. Now, let me split this again. Okay. So now if we're working on this database, let's say doing some development, testing things out, playing around with it, this is great. Now, maybe I don't want to leave it running all the time, so I can stop it, and later I can start it again. Okay, so let's do that. And so there's a command. Now there's VoltDB commands to shut down a database. So I can do both ways, because I can use the VoltDB VoltAdmin command, and so I would say VoltAdmin shutdown, and this would take a -h parameter for the host that I'm connecting to. In this case, it's localhost, but it's support 32.768. Again, I could do that. That will connect to VoltDB as sort of an admin client and tell VoltDB to shut itself down. VoltDB will shut itself down. There's some further instructions I could give it with other parameters if I wanted. But so the VoltDB shuts down. Well, when VoltDB shuts down, then the script, that entry point script that's part of our Docker image, that stops running. And when that stops running, the container stops. So that's one way to do it. But with VoltDB, you know, you can also just, you could stop the container, and that's going to accomplish the same thing, basically. So there's not really a need for a graceful shutdown with VoltDB all the time. So so we can just do that if we want. We can stop the instance. But if anyone who's looking ahead knows what we're going to find, what we're going to discover here, because of the way Docker handles the file storage. So we'll get to that. All right, so we can say Docker container stop node 1. Okay, now I'm not going to do the remove node 1 because I'll do that later if I want to start over and run, you know, kind of rebuild the container again or rerun it. But it's just to show it's easier if I want to restart that container. So I can say Docker PS, there's nothing. And I can say Docker. Now I can just say Docker start node 1. It already knows what node 1 is. That's the name of this container we created before. And it knows all the parameters and all those things. It's just not running. And now it's running again. Okay. So every time you start that container, we got to say Docker port node 1. Let's see. We might have gotten a different assignment. Yes. So this time around, we have a different port assignment. So this 21212 is now mapped to 32.777. So if we want to go into SQL command, --port equals, we got to say 32.777. And we're into the database. So the database is up and running again. That's fantastic. All right, list tables. Let's see our foo. Nothing is there. So what happened? Well, so we shut down the database, and the database's storage is all inside this container. And, well, we shut down the container, really, and that shut down the database. But with it, it took all of that local inside the container storage with it. It's gone. That's ephemeral. So just by stopping and restarting the container, you know, anything that was stored on disk is wiped out. As part of, I guess, the nice thing of building up and tearing down very easily with Docker. But if we're let's say developing our schema and doing testing an application and building it out, we probably want our data to still be there. Certainly, if you're going to eventually run VoltDB using Docker in a production scenario, you definitely want that. So we got to look at storage. So that was sort of the next item on our agenda. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit this time. Now I'm going to destroy this container. So I'm going to say, let's stop it again, node 1. You can see what containers you've got with the Docker ls command, or sorry, Docker container ls command, but you see it's not listed. That's because it's not running. So you want ls-a, show me all, and okay, now you see there is something, but it's exited. It's not running. Okay, we can remove it, and that's going to delete it. Okay, and now it's really gone. Okay. So, and we're doing that because what we're going to do is now change this command. So if we just say Docker start, it doesn't give us a chance to change the parameters and change the setup or the configuration. But if we get rid of it and do Docker run again, we can provide all of these parameters. Okay. So let's scroll down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add what are called bind mounts, and I'm going to add 2 of them. So one is for the deployment XML file. Now, VoltDB doesn't need to have a deployment XML file specified for it to start. So if you're doing, like we have a previous webinar, getting started, that's just, you know, like on your workstation. You know, so you can download VoltDB and initialize a database instance and start the database, and you don't have to have a deployment XML file. If there's a default one that will just get generated automatically, and so that's fine. But that's what there's also one that comes along inside the image of this Docker image, and there's also, we can override it. So we're going to override it here because we've got our own deployment XML file I've set up ahead of time, and we can take a quick look at this. In particular, one of the things we've enabled is snapshot enabled equals true, frequency 2 minutes. So this is one of the features that we've recently moved back to the open source. So open source VoltDB, you can have snapshots, you can have whatever frequency you want. You can also take them manually. And so you have your database persistence to disk through the snapshot feature. The typical persistence to disk for VoltDB is command log. That's not enabled because that feature is not available on Community Edition. But we'll go, when we get to the building the image for Enterprise Edition, we'll change that setting. We'll use that instead. Okay, and everything else is kind of a default setting, so that's enough about that. One thing here, we've set the sites per host. That is how many of those SQL execution engines we're running in parallel inside the VoltDB process itself. So when we partitioned our table is going to be divided across 6 partitions because of this. If you have a larger cluster, it gets subdivided a little differently, and you can have redundancy involved as well. But just for simplicity, we're just going to have this sites per host 6. Okay. So we want to use this deployment file. We want to use our, our specified settings, and partly that's also because if we use the community image, the snapshot may not be enabled. I think it's not enabled by default, but we want to have it enabled. So if we're working on this, every 2 minutes our data gets saved and we'll be okay. All right, so let's just copy this command in place. I'll here make it a little bigger so everyone can see. What we're doing is the same command as before, but we're passing in 2 -v parameters. So -v is for like a volume or adding storage in Docker. It's a Docker command. And what we're doing is we're giving the absolute path of a file or a folder that we have on our host machine, on my laptop in this case. And then a colon, and then the path that is going to be within the Docker image itself, or the container. So, and now why is it /temp/deployment XML? Our startup script that's baked into the image is looking for it to be in that folder, in that place. So that's why we're putting it there. If you build your own image, you can change these things if you want. And then second one, so this is our deployment file, so we're going to get our configuration settings running. And then this is the folder where we have our persistence to disk, where all of the database, everything that's on disk about the data that we're storing, as well as the configuration of the cluster and what was running, is all there. So this is going to be right in our folder that we're working with right here. That's our little webinar standalone folder, and this is going to be to the container. It's going to be the var VoltDB folder. Okay. And everything else is the same as before. So we're just going to keep all that the same. Let's copy this. All right, we removed everything, so we're ready to go. All right, so we're going to run this container. Okay, so that's running. Okay, so now what we can do, just like before, we can say Docker port node 1. Oh, did I give it a different name? I think I gave, sorry. I changed the name. Volt 1. Okay. So we can still do that. We can still do SQL command -- port equals So this is going to be 32,786 now. Okay. Oops, that's not the right command. List tables. Okay, our tables aren't there because this is the first time we've started it this way. All right, create table foo. ID integer not null. Message varchar 100. Let's partition the table. Okay. Another thing we can do, instead of insert into, we can call, there's, let's say, list procedures. There is a procedure that was automatically generated for us called foo.insert. You get one of these for every table. So you can use that as well. We can say execute foo.insert. The parameters are separated by spaces, so I can say 1, hello. And I can say 2, I can use quotes. Okay. So we have data, we have a table. Okay, good enough. We can exit. And now, this time around, now we can wait for 2 minutes to have a snapshot written to disk. It may or may not be written to disk. Let's take a look at what's going on disk since we're in the same folder here. So we have this VoltDB root we see created. That's what VoltDB creates in whatever folder it's kind of that it's running in by default. So all of the storage it has on disk is going to be there. If we look at this, we see there's some various folders set up, but the ones that are really being used is a config, has some things in there because we've created a schema, we created a table, we've got a few things going. There's a log file here, volt.log. We can see the details of what's happened. There's nothing under this snapshots folder. That's where our data is going to be stored in 2 minutes. So at some point that might be there. Still nothing there. So, but what we can do is we can just say we don't want to wait. We can say volt admin shutdown --save. That's going to take save a snapshot when it shuts down. And we can say -h localhost : what was the port we used before? 32,786 this time. Well, I will leave this for another day to figure out what exactly is not happening. But needless to say, the 2 minutes have elapsed, and we have a snapshot now. So that is good enough for my demonstration purposes here today. So now we can stop this container, restart it. Docker container stop Volt1. Okay. Docker PS, nothing's running. Now we can restart it. Now remember, like, this folder is here on our local machine. It's been mapped, and so the data's still there. We could even actually delete, we could say remove the container and start it up completely. So we can even do that. We could say Docker container rm volt1. So it's gone. And then we can run the same command yet again. So we're building a whole new container. We could even change, maybe change some things if we wanted. But we don't need to. So we're going to run that again. Now that's using the same folder, and the files are already there. So it's going to reload that data this time. Okay, so if we go to SQL command --port equals 32,795, we see we have a foo table still, and our data is still there. So that's how we can add storage. Now, if you're on Windows, this is going to be a little different because the paths on Windows are, C:/ whatever, and so that's doesn't play so friendly with Docker. So this whole mapping, this users, our folder here that we were using doesn't work on Windows. What you would do instead is use what's called a volume rather than a bind mount. And a volume, it's the same thing. It's like this. I'm not going to go through all this, but what you do is, so in this case for the deployment file, I'm still doing a bind mount. No, so that's not going to work on Windows. You may have to do that differently, or we'll get into. There may be other ways you can set your deployment XML file, but for the storage of the data, and certainly for the deployment as well, you could just use the defaults if you wanted. That would work as well. But so for the data, you can just say node 1 or Volt 1 or whatever you want to call it. So that is just the name of the volume. It will get created for you. If it already exists, it'll use it again. And that's managed by Docker itself. So Docker knows where's the actual path on your Windows box that goes to that volume. And in fact, it's probably not even just a folder. It's probably some file that it's kind of, everything's hidden within this file, buried inside a file. So it's managed by Docker, and then you can use various Docker commands to do things with that. All right, so we're going to just skip that, but that's just wanted to point that out if anyone's following along on Windows. Now, the host count. So this is one of those things, VoltDB it has different ways you can specify how many hosts are going to be in the cluster and who are they. So let me just make this a little bigger. So just to show, for our single node, we had host underscore count equals 1. We don't need that. We could take that off and just say hosts equals node 1. If we're doing the cluster, we could say, like we did up here, we haven't done the cluster yet. I'm sorry. We're getting to that. But when we get to the cluster, we'll see we have the hosts specified as a list. Yeah, down here. We're going to do this next. So hosts equals node 1, node 2, node 3. We do not have to say that the count is going to be 3, because we're listing all of the nodes that are going to be in the cluster. Now, there's another thing. If let's say you have 20 nodes in a very large cluster, you don't want to list out 20 hosts. Okay, so you could pick 2 or 2 or 3. Probably a good idea just to have 2 for redundancy. You could say hosts equals node 1, node 2, and then you could say host count equals 20. So until there's all 20 are there, it's gonna wait to start the cluster, but they're gonna try to connect to node 1 and node 2 for clustering initiation purposes, so they can all find each other. Okay. All right, so that's what we're going to do next. So let's just go ahead and, well, we can just. So we can just exit that. We can. Okay. Okay. All right, so we don't have any containers right now, just because I may use the same names. All right, so now we're going to go do a cluster, and I'm just putting this in a different folder just because I just wanted a clean starting point. We have a deployment file. Okay, and this is the same as what we were just seeing. We have snapshots are enabled. Oh, okay. All right, we also have a start script. We're going to get to that. So when we want to start a cluster, we could do this manually, but we don't have a lot of time. We had to do it quickly. So you could run and start, but basically what we're doing differently from before is we're saying the name is node 1. And we're giving it, say, a volume. Oops, sorry. In this example, we're giving it a volume name, node 1. Each node is going to get a separate folder. So we could do it here like this example with separate volumes, node 1, node 2, node 3, and the containers are named node 1, node 2, and node 3, and all 3 of those names are listed as the hosts parameter. So they know how to talk to each other, and VoltDB is going to know how many hosts total are going to be in the cluster, because we didn't specify the host count, but we've given it a list of hosts. So that will work, or we could do this start script. So let me just show what's going on in the start script. Let me pull it up. It's a little easier to read with colors. So, all right. So it's pretty simple. We're setting a few variables up front, basically just so it's easier to read and easier to change. So we're going to run version 7.8. We've got our host count. We can specify as the first parameter, I want 3 hosts, I want 2 hosts, I want 10 hosts. If we don't specify it, it's going to be defaulting to 3. That's what this little -3 :-3 thing does. Pretty cool. So our storage is going to be right here in this folder that we're in. It's my home directory /webinar/cluster, but it could be whatever you want. And in that folder, I've got my deployment XML file. Okay. So so this is just going to build that host string. It's going to say Volt1, Volt2, Volt3 with commas in between. So this is just taking care of like the first time you don't add a comma, the second time you add a comma. So it's pretty straightforward, and we're just gonna it's gonna tell us what the host list is, and then we're gonna loop through again. This is sequence from 1 to host count, so from 1, 2, 3, whatever. It's going to repeat. It's going to take that prefix, so it's going to say, okay, the name is Volt1, and it's going to put that storage. It's going to have a separate folder for Volt1, Volt2, Volt3, and the container is going to be named same thing, and the hosts are going to be the same set of hosts, and we're actually specifying the host count here, even though we don't have to, so that's great. All right, so that script is there. We will provide this in the follow-up email, make sure this is available. This is a simpler, kind of a simple startup script. All right, so we're going to do that, and we'll get a 3-node cluster. So now we get 3 of these unique IDs because it created 3 containers, or was running 3 containers. All right, and now we can say, let's see, Docker port Volt1. Now, so when you have a cluster, you can talk to any of the nodes or all of the nodes if you like. So we could, if we're running an application like a benchmark or something, we might want to connect to all 3 of those nodes together. But we're just doing a little command line, one SQL statement at a time. So we could just connect to any one of the nodes. Again, this 21212 is the standard port that we're connecting on. That's a little bit of VoltDB knowledge. So SQL command -- port equals 32804. Okay. A couple of things, since this looks the same as before, I'll show you exec. We said execute before. You can say exec for short. This is a built-in function called System Information Overview. Okay, and it gives us this big output, various properties, and we see on the first first column is the host ID. So we have 201. So we have 3 hosts in our cluster, and they're all running, and they have these, you know, it tells us what ports they're running and all these things like that. What are their IP addresses? So, so we've got that. Now, I should just say, if you're a whiz with Docker, there are probably ways you can, you know, not have to look up what is this 32768 port number. I'm not yet a whiz with Docker, so in a full honesty, so this is a way that works for me for the demo. But there's undoubtedly ways you can, you know, make these host names easily recognized, and ways you can make it simpler on the networking side of things. Okay, so let's do the same. What do we, I don't know if we want to, just in the interest of time, we may not want to create a table again. Let's maybe move on, but you get the idea. We can create a table. We've got our storage. Oh, let me show you that real quick. In our folder here, we have subfolders Volt 1, Volt 2, Volt 3. That's the names when we set up that the bind mounts for each of those Docker containers. We specified the name of the container, so that got created for us. Those directories did not need to exist. Docker created those for us, which is nice. And we can see under Volt 1, there's a VoltDB root subfolder. That's what we saw before, because before we were just using the parent directory as the bind mount and not adding the name of the container as a subfolder. But we want each of these containers in a cluster to have their own separate disk storage. We don't want to use the same folder for them. There can be interference on the files. So VoltDB expects these to be separate. So we've got Volt 1, Volt 2, Volt 3. There's a VoltDB root underneath each, and then that's where you see there's snapshots, and there's, you know, various things like that. So so that is that. So just wanted to point that out. And then, you know, so likewise, we can shut down these, we can stop and restart these nodes. In this case, you know, we started it with a script, so we could have another script to, you know, kill it all and recreate it, you know, however you want to do that. So, you know, with containers, you're much more in the mode of like the, you know, you have a herd of cattle and you can just shoot the one that has a you know, a broken foot. And it's not, you know, they're not your pets. So, you know, if you're running with a VM or kind of doing things manually on bare metal, you know, you go through all the configuration manually, you set up VoltDB and you get everything going, and like you never get rid of it. You keep it, you know, maintain it, and it evolves over time. Whereas with these Docker containers, you know, you're building it up, you know, from configuration, and you can tear them down just as easily and rebuild them. And in this case, because we have a folder saving our VoltDB persistence to disk separately, the containers can come and go. What's on disk is not moving, and the data would still be there when we rebuild that cluster with totally new containers. So there's a lot more of that that we can do, which is great if you're changing the configuration and making those rapid kind of iterations. Okay, so this has all been using VoltDB Community, and again, we never had to download anything except for Docker itself. We're using an image that's publicly available, and we talked about that is on hub.docker.com. Okay, so that's not the Enterprise Edition. So if we go to voltdb.com, and we can click on the download link, and we'll see here a couple options. So there's a direct download link here for the Community Edition, or for the Enterprise Edition, we can click here on Try VoltDB, and what that will do is we will enter a little bit of contact information, and then it will send us an email with the download link. And So that's another way you can download VoltDB. It comes included with a 30-day trial license. And so then, what are the differences? Just briefly, you get command logging. We talked about that. So that's a per transaction durability. As soon as you insert a record, it's already persisted to disk. You don't have to worry about every 2 minutes there's a snapshot, or when I shut down, I want to make sure I take a snapshot. That is what you can do with the Community Edition. And you can also enable that on Enterprise, but the command log is better. It will do immediate durability to disk. And then you can have elastic expansion of the cluster. That would allow you to take a 3-node cluster and grow it to 5 nodes or 10 nodes or whatever dynamically. You'd be adding like sort of nodes at a time, and that's supported only in the Enterprise Edition, something that is sort of an extra feature. And then multi-cluster replication. So this is where you can have, we created a cluster of 3 nodes. You could have, say, another cluster of 3 nodes that is essentially mirrored what is going on the master cluster. So you can have a replica cluster. You can even have multi-data center active bidirectional replication between the clusters. So they're both making changes and executing transactions, and they keep each other informed of the changes that those produce in the data, and keep each other synchronized. So those are all fantastic features that are in the Enterprise Edition. And if you wanted to try those and use Docker, then you need to build an image. That's what we're getting to here. Okay. Okay, before I go, Docker container ls, all right. Let me just stop those. And I'll remove them just to clean up in case I use the same names I don't recall. Okay, so we're going to go into this Enterprise folder. And we have a few things here. So this is something, again, we will send some links to make sure you are able to get this, these files for your own use. So we're going to be building a container, and what that needs is what we see here. Basically, there's a Docker file, which is for any Docker image, you have to have a Docker file to build it. That may reference some things that are right here in the same folder, which it does. So there's a deployment XML file that we're specifying here. We're going to bake that into the image. We can also change it later and override it, because that's something that's supported in our entry point script. This is the script that's going to run when the container starts. This is just like what we did before, only now you're seeing what was inside this image. I've already downloaded VoltDB Enterprise Edition, so we don't have to go through all of that. And so let me just quickly go through the steps. So basically, all right, if we've already downloaded VoltDB, we've already unzipped it, basically. So we have a, so we have, sorry, let me go down here. I have separate instructions here. So we have a thing here. We're going to specify the version that we downloaded, because that's something that our Docker file is looking for. And we're going to call this image that we're creating VoltDB-ent for Enterprise. Okay. So this --build arg this is a Docker parameter that's part of Docker build, and in this case, our Docker file is looking for this value, and it's looking for the folder that we already downloaded and extracted, and it's going to create it and tag it as VoltDB-ent and use the local path for the build process. Okay, so we can run that. Oops, sorry. Now I have already done this, so so I already have that image. It takes a few minutes, so it's going to follow the Docker file, which is basically All right, so it's going to start with a Ubuntu 14.04 image. It's going to do some upgrades and updates. It's going to make sure we have Java JDK 8 installed. It's going to set the time zone and set which ports are we going to be exposing for VoltDB. And we've got here like the kit version, which can be overridden. So we're going to override that with the 7.8.2, which is the latest. And it's going to copy those files in and do the, copy the deployment file, build this thing, move that script into the image. So it does, this is, that's what it's going to do. All right, so we've already done that. And so now, last step is we want to run a standalone instance using this image. So it's the same command that we used before, only at the end we didn't say VoltDB/VoltDB-community. That was the public hub image. We're going to say VoltDB-ent, which is locally the one that we just built here. Now you can of course check these in on in the repository, and then you can reference them however you like. You can use your own account for that. I'm sorry. So let me just copy this command, and we're going to call this one VoltDB-ent-1. Okay, and now we can say Docker port VoltDB-ent-1. We get our ports, we're running, we can SQL command to 32831, and we're in. So from here, you know what to do. We've already gone through that. So I just want to thank everyone for your attention. We've gone through, just to recap, we've run VoltDB as just a single instance container. We added some storage, so our data got persisted to our local disk. You could use a volume. There's different options there. We can run a cluster of VoltDB nodes that work together as one database, and that's on a set of containers. And we can now also build our own image using the Enterprise Edition download and do all of these same things again with Enterprise Edition. Okay, so I now open the floor to any questions, and I appreciate everyone's time. Let's see. Okay, so there was a question on what is a Docker container, and this is kind of a Docker question more than a VoltDB question, but I'll try to give my understanding of it. I can explain. So Docker has essentially the idea of creating a container in Linux, and that's an older concept that's existed, for quite a while. So, I mean, I'll be dating myself, but I remember when I was in college, I would connect to a Linux or a Unix server to check my email. And in that case, I had my own account, I had a folder, and I didn't have permission to anything else, and I had limits on my account. So I couldn't download more than a couple megabytes or something. And if I were running any software within my folder, I would be restricted on how much CPU I could use, so that I'm not interfering with everybody else, because there were thousands of people on the server. Nowadays, typically you don't have that many people, all simultaneously logged into a Linux server, but you still want to have those kind of limits. And there's this thing called Linux containers, I think it's called LXC, that came out several years back that lets you do the same kind of thing where you set those limits, only it's like more separated from the Linux OS. So you're able to run different software on top of it, and keep things running within this restricted world of a container. And Docker came along and built on that and said, well, there's VMs. You can run a VM on a machine. That has a lot of overhead. But what's great about it is I can set one up and I can save the image of it, and I can copy that around. It's a big file, but I can copy it around, and I can run it somewhere else, and everything's there. So Docker took that idea of the container and said, well, you need an image for it. So they added that piece and then added a lot of tooling around it so that you can now have an image for your container, and you can start it, and it's got everything it needs to run whatever it is you're running. So you can do, you can do whatever you want. You can have a container that's just going to give you a certain version of Linux and nothing else, and you just get bash, you just get a command line, and you can start to run stuff. But more typically, like what we've done is, like, we have a database. It has a start process, a start command. So we have a script that's going to run that start command when we start the container. So it's tied to that process, and when that process, if it crashes or if we shut it down using the database interface, then that container goes down with it. So we're coupling the process with the container. We've got storage. Now there's the image of the container itself, and that's basically the configuration. So that's not the ephemeral storage of like log files and things of what was running. That's the software that we installed that we baked into that image. So you have this image, and then the container is when you're running one of those images on your machine, and then it's isolated inside this container. You have these networking capabilities. You can set up a bridge network or other types of networks so that those containers can talk to each other, and you can connect to them as well from your machine. So, and then we're going to continue this in future webinars and look at some of the more advanced things you can do with Docker. There's a lot of interest we're getting in Kubernetes, and that's something we're kind of in the early stages of developing some examples for. So that's a topic we'll probably have in 2018 for this continuing series of developer-focused webinars. Okay, well, I want to appreciate just to thank everyone. I think we're at our time limit, and thank everyone for attending and for all of your patience with me and attention. And there's going to be an email that will go out to all of the attendees with some follow-up information, and we'll put some links in there to make sure you'll be able to find any of the files and things that we were using on the webinar. All of this stuff, I think, will eventually be on our website. So if you go to look at our documentation, you'll be able to find a tutorial on getting started with Docker. So it'll all be there as well, I think, in a short number of weeks. So looking forward to everyone. If you want to contact us, you can reach out to info@voltdb.com. If you have any questions, we're always happy to answer and get on the phone and talk with people if they're interested in VoltDB, see what you want to do with it, and see if it's the right solution for for your data needs. So thanks, everyone, and have a very great holiday season and a great weekend.